I never intended to destroy a legend. I am a historian, a keeper of stories, not a breaker of them. The Viking Berserker to me was always the pinnacle of warrior myth. A figure of raw, untamable power, draped in bearskin, roaring with the spirit of a wild animal, loyal only to his king and the promise of Valhalla. I had built a career on this image, lecturing on their ferocity, writing about their pivotal role in the unification of Norway. They were the monstrous, beautiful heart of the Viking age, a symbol of a warrior ethos so pure it bordered on the divine. I see now that this comfort was a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy to shield us from a truth far more squalid and terrifying. My journey into that truth didn't begin in a library, surrounded by the comforting scent of old vellum and dust. It began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, drizzly Oslo day that seeps into your bones. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. Dr. Anya Sharma from the National Archaeological Forensics Unit. They'd found something. A farmer draining a peat bog near the remote village of Skogstad had hit a cache of objects with his machinery. It wasn't a ship, not a hoard of silver. It was, she said, anomalous. That word, so sterile and scientific, hung in the air long after I'd hung up the phone. Anomalous. In my world, anomalies are the loose threads that, when pulled, can unravel everything you thought you knew. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I told myself it was just another find, another piece of the puzzle. But a part of me, a deep, instinctual part that I had long ignored, knew this was different. I'd always felt a whisper of doubt behind the saga's thunderous praise of the Berserker. A subtle dissonance in the tales. Why did the skalds, the poets, describe them with such a mix of awe and palpable fear? Why were they celebrated as heroes in one verse and condemned as madmen in the next? The stories valorized their battle fury, the Berserker gang, as a gift from Odin, a sacred rage that made them impervious to steel and fire. They bit their shields, howled like wolves, and waded into enemy lines as living personifications of death. But then there were the other stories. The quiet, grim footnotes. The tales of berserkers who, in the grip of their rage, couldn't distinguish friend from foe, who slaughtered their own shield brothers in a blind frenzy. The accounts of the exhaustion that followed, a prostration so profound it left them weaker than a child. These weren't the stories we put in museum exhibits. They didn't fit the clean, heroic narrative. I packed my bag with a sense of foreboding, a feeling that I was not traveling toward a discovery but an indictment. I was going to Skogstad not as a historian ready to celebrate the past, but as an investigator, drawn by an anomaly, about to stand witness to a forgotten crime. The myth I had so carefully curated felt suddenly fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over dark, cold water. And as I drove north, the city dissolving into a landscape of stark mountains and black water, I had the unnerving sensation that something was about to break the surface. I was about to learn that the true horror of the Berserker wasn't his strength, but his weakness. It wasn't his connection to a god, but his utter, tragic and exploited humanity. And this knowledge would cost me the comfort of my own stories, leaving me with a truth as bleak and unforgiving as the bog itself. I was looking for a warrior. What I found was a victim and a monster born not of myth, but of men. The Skogstad bog was not a place of history, it felt like a place outside of time. A wound in the earth, perpetually weeping cold, black water. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying life, a scent of immense, indifferent age. Dr. Sharma met me at the edge of the excavation site, a sterile white tent stark against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. She was a woman whose precision and calm were a stark contrast to the chaotic scene. The farmer's machinery had torn a violent gash in the peat, revealing the objects not with the careful patience of a brush, but with the brute force of steel. I could feel my academic detachment dissolving as I stepped closer. This wasn't a grave. Graves have a certain grim order. A body, grave goods arranged with purpose. A sword for the warrior's hand, a necklace for the throat. This was a jumble. A chaotic deposit of items that felt less like a burial and more like a desperate act of concealment. My eyes scanned the finds laid out on a muddy tarp. There were weapons, yes, but they were broken. A sword snapped at the hilt, a spearhead bent into a useless curve. The iconic round shield was there, but it was splintered, its iron boss dented inwards. And the teeth marks. My God, the teeth marks. Deep, frantic gouges in the wood, as if a starving animal had tried to devour it. My mind flashed to the sagas, to the descriptions of berserkers biting their shields in their fury. I had always pictured it as a symbolic act, a display of aggression. Seeing it here, in the ragged wounds on the wood, it looked like an act of pure, unhinged madness. Beside the shattered weapons were other, stranger things. Bundles of herbs tied with gut that I didn't recognize. And bones. A disturbing mix of animal and human remains, all jumbled together. The skull of a bear, its canines unnaturally sharp, lay beside a human femur. A wolf's jaw was tangled with the vertebrae of a man. It was ritualistic, but it wasn't the proud paganism of the sagas. It felt older, darker, more desperate. Sharma pointed to a small carved wooden totem, caked in peat. "This is what I wanted you to see," she said, her voice low. It was a humanoid figure but twisted. Its limbs were too long, its back arched in a posture of agony. Its face was a rictus of a scream, the mouth open impossibly wide. But the most disturbing feature was its eyes. They were hollowed out, and in their place were pushed two small dark objects. Sharma had identified them. Belladonna seeds. Nightshade. A potent, deadly hallucinogen. A poison. I stared at the screaming figure, at its poisoned eyes. A wave of nausea rolled over me. This wasn't a tribute to a warrior. It was a totem of induced insanity. A depiction of a mind being violently torn apart. The questions started to cascade through my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Why break the weapons? Was it to symbolically kill the warrior's spirit? To sever him from his identity? And the bones, the herbs, the poison, was this an offering to the gods, or the toolkit for creating something monstrous for them? I spent hours at that site, the drizzle turning into a steady, cold rain. I picked up a piece of the shattered shield. The wood was waterlogged and heavy. I ran my thumb over the teeth marks. I tried to imagine the man who had done this. Not a hero. Not a stoic warrior. But a man in the throes of something unimaginable. A state of being so violent and terrifying that he had to literally chew through his own defenses. The noble image of the berserker, the one I had lectured on for years, was cracking before my eyes. In its place was this detritus of a ritual I couldn't comprehend. The artifacts from the Skogstad bog didn't speak of glory. They spoke of pain. They whispered of a process, a hideously intimate transformation. As I finally left the site that evening, the screaming face of the wooden totem was burned into my mind. I was no longer investigating a myth. I was investigating a methodology. The bog hadn't given up the body of a warrior, it had given up his recipe. And I had the sickening feeling that I was just beginning to understand the ingredients. I retreated to the archives, to the familiar embrace of the written word. If the bog had shown me the how, perhaps the sagas, read with new eyes, could tell me the why. For weeks I did not leave my study. I surrounded myself with the great Icelandic sagas, Egil's saga, the Heimskringla Rolf Kraki's saga. These were the foundational texts of my field, epic poems I thought I knew like the back of my hand. But now I wasn't reading for heroism. I was hunting for shadows. I was looking for the fear I'd felt at the bog, reflected in the ink of monks 1,000 years ago. I forced myself to ignore the grand battles and the noble speeches. I focused on the small, telling details, the moments of discomfort the skalds couldn't quite smooth over. And I found them everywhere. The mythos of the berserker began to peel away, revealing something raw and septic underneath. In Egil's saga, the berserkers Kveldulf and Skallagrim are not just mighty warriors. They are described as shapeshifters, their fury so profound it alters their physical being, making them something other than human. But the text is laced with a thread of dread. Their rage is unpredictable. When Kveldulf's son is killed, his grief manifests as a berserker gang. He and his men in their possessed state hunt down the perpetrators, but the description is not of a righteous quest for vengeance. It's a rampage. A blind, howling slaughter. The text emphasizes their terrifying appearance, their animalistic sounds. The men they fight are not just defeated, they are torn apart. The awe in the telling is mingled with revulsion. The forgotten victims began to take shape in my mind. Not just enemy soldiers but the crew of the ship, Egil's own men, who watched their leader transform into an uncontrollable beast. What must it have been like to stand on that deck, your captain suddenly a monster, his eyes rolled back, foam on his lips, a threat to everyone around him? I found more. In the saga of Rolf Kraki, the champion Bodvar fights in the form of a spectral bear, a powerful, awe-inspiring image. But the magic is conditional. He warns his king not to call his name, not to break the trance. When the king, in a moment of desperation, does just that, the bear vanishes and Bodvar is found in his tent, weak and helpless, to be easily slain. The implication was chilling. The state was fragile. It was not inherent strength but a temporary and vulnerable state of altered consciousness. The berserker gang was not a power to be commanded, but a spirit to be precariously channeled. Break the ritual and the man is left broken. This resonated deeply with the finds from the bog, the shattered weapons, the sense of a ritual gone wrong or violently concluded. My inner monologue became a dialogue with the ghosts of these texts. You see? I would think, tracing a line of Old Norse with a trembling finger. You were afraid of them too. The most damning evidence came from the later sagas and the legal codes of the Christian era. In Grettir's saga, the berserkers are no longer heroes. They are villains. Thugs and bullies who use their fearsome reputation to terrorize communities, challenging farmers to duels for their land and their wives. They are portrayed as socially corrosive, a menace to the order of a civilized society. And then came the law. The Gragas, the law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth, explicitly outlawed the berserker gang. A man who entered such a state faced lesser outlawry, a 3-year exile. Why would you banish your greatest weapon? Unless it wasn't a weapon. It was a sickness, a public danger. Reading these laws, I felt a grim vindication. The authorities who wrote them weren't trying to suppress a noble warrior tradition. They were trying to quarantine a plague. The forgotten victims weren't just on the battlefield. They were the farmers, the families, the communities who had to live with these men once the wars were over. They were the ones who had to face the man whose mind had been deliberately broken for a king's gain, and who was now left to wander the land, a shell of a human being, possessed by a rage he could no longer control or understand. The sagas were not heroic epics. I saw that now. They were trauma narratives, written by a society grappling with a phenomenon it both revered and reviled. The stories were an attempt to mythologize a horror, to turn a terrifying, pathological reality into a source of national pride. But the truth was there, hiding in plain sight. In the fear in the eyes of the Shield brothers, in the brokenness of the champion, in the laws designed to protect society from its own heroes. The men in the bog were not just killed. They were silenced. My job now was to give them back their voice. The image of the screaming totem with its belladonna eyes haunted my waking thoughts and my dreams. The sagas described the what, the terrifying rage, the social fallout. The bog hinted at the how, a dark ritual. But I was missing the mechanism, the scientific bridge between a man and a monster. The myth attributed the berserker gang to the will of Odin, a divine madness. I couldn't accept that. Divinity is clean. What I had seen in the bog was messy, profane, and reeked of human manipulation. I began to delve into the grim science of induced psychosis, a world away from the poetic cadence of the sagas. I spent weeks corresponding with pharmacologists, toxicologists, and forensic psychologists, people who dealt not in myth, but in the measurable decay of the human mind. My office, once filled with maps of ancient trade routes, was now littered with chemical diagrams and psychiatric studies. The first and most famous theory was mushrooms. Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric with its iconic red cap and white spots. It was a known hallucinogen, used in shamanic rituals across Siberia. The effects seemed to fit: hallucinations, delirium, muscle spasms, altered perception of size and strength. I imagined a ritual specialist, a shaman, carefully preparing a brew from these fungi, feeding it to a warrior before battle. It was a compelling theory, one that turned the divine madness into a simple, if potent, poisoning. But as I dug deeper, the fit wasn't perfect. Dr. Henrik Larsson, a Danish toxicologist I consulted, was skeptical. The primary effects of muscarine poisoning, he wrote to me in a terse email, are not rage. They are vomiting, sweating, drooling, and severe gastrointestinal distress. Your fearless warrior would more likely be incapacitated by diarrhea than filled with battle fury. He pointed out that while it could induce delirium, the consistent, directed rage described in the sagas was an unlikely outcome. The theory was too simple, too neat. The next candidate was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. Ergot poisoning, or St. Anthony's fire, was a medieval horror. It caused convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs. Could certainly drive a man mad. But it was also unpredictable and debilitating, often leading to gangrene and death. It was a plague, not a tool. Could a king risk his elite soldiers to such a crude and uncontrollable poison? It seemed unlikely. The weapon was too imprecise, as likely to destroy his own army as the enemy's. I was growing frustrated, searching for a single chemical key to unlock the berserker. It felt like I was missing the point. The answer wasn't just in a substance. It was in a process. A conversation with Dr. Eris Thorne, a retired military psychologist, shifted my entire perspective. I had described the bog finds to him, the sagas, the chemical theories. He listened patiently, his silence on the other end of the line more insightful than any academic argument. "You're looking for a drug," he finally said, his voice raspy. "You should be looking for a program. In modern special forces we call it stress inoculation. You break a man down to his foundations. You use sleep deprivation, extreme physical exertion, psychological abuse. You strip away his identity. Then, you rebuild him into what you want him to be. You create a trigger, a switch that can be flipped in combat. It's a form of controlled, weaponized psychosis." A cold dread spread through my chest. He continued. "The substances you're talking about? The mushrooms, the belladonna from your bog totem? They aren't the cause. They're an accelerant. They're a tool used within a much larger psychological framework. You take a man, maybe one who is already traumatized from a previous battle, what we would call PTSD. His mind is already fertile ground for dissociation. You put him through a hellish ritual. You starve him, you beat him, you chant over him for days. You feed him hallucinogens not to create the rage, but to break down the final barriers of his conscious mind. The rage is already there, the trauma, the fear, the grief. The ritual and the drugs just unleash it. They point it like a weapon. Suddenly all the pieces clicked into place. The screaming totem wasn't just a symbol of poisoning, it was a symbol of psychological torture. The broken weapons weren't a sign of disrespect. They were part of the process of destroying the warrior's old identity. The jumbled bones were relics from the terrifying, disorienting rituals designed to sever him from reality. The Berserker gang wasn't a gift from a god. It was a conditioned response. A trauma response, deliberately cultivated and triggered on the battlefield. The men weren't possessed by the spirit of a bear, they were possessed by their own broken minds. This was a truth far more chilling than any myth. It replaced a pantheon of gods with the cold, calculating cruelty of men. The shaman wasn't a mystic communing with the divine. He was a master manipulator, a psychologist of the darkest kind, using ritual and pharmacology to turn human beings into predictable, disposable weapons. The Berserker was not born. He was made. And the process of his making was an act of profound and unforgivable violence. The revelation that the Berserker gang was a manufactured state, a form of weaponized trauma, forced me to look beyond the battlefield. If this was a program, a deliberate methodology, then it had to have roots in the bedrock of Old Norse belief. The sagas presented the Berserker as a warrior, but the evidence from the bog, the herbs, the totems, the animal remains, screamed of something else. It screamed of magic. I turned my research to the most feared and secretive corner of Norse cosmology, seer. Seer was the Old Norse term for a specific kind of shamanic magic, primarily associated with prophecy and shaping fate. It was a practice considered unmanly by the warrior elite, often relegated to women, the volar or seeresses. Odin himself was a master of seer, a fact that made the other gods uneasy. Unlike the noble, open combat of the warrior, seer was about altered states of consciousness, about communing with spirits, about blurring the lines between worlds. It involved chanting, drumming, and often the use of psychoactive plants to induce a trance. The practitioners would enter a state of ecstasy or frenzy, where they could gain hidden knowledge or influence the minds of others. As I read the descriptions of seer rituals, the parallels with my emerging picture of the Berserker were undeniable and terrifying. It was all there. The trance-like state. The loss of self-control. The ecstatic frenzy. The animalistic behavior, as shamans were believed to take on the spirits of animals during their journeys. The pieces were falling into place with a horrifying certainty. The Berserker tradition was not a warrior cult. It was a corruption of a shamanic one. A spiritual practice, designed for insight and communion, had been twisted and perverted for the singular purpose of violence. The Berserker gang was a seer ritual, weaponized and forced upon men. The shaman's ecstatic trance, a tool for seeing the future, had become the soldier's blinding rage, a tool for ending it. This recontextualization changed everything. It explained the deep ambivalence the Norse people felt. They respected the power but feared the source, because they recognized its unmanly and chaotic origins in the world of magic, not the world of honorable combat. It also explained the secrecy and the ritualistic elements found in the bog. That wasn't a warrior's burial ground. It was a ritual site, a place where the transformation happened, hidden away from the main longhouse, much like the seer ceremonies were conducted in private. I felt as if I had stumbled upon a state secret, 1,000 years old. I began to find clues in the language itself. The word berserker is traditionally translated as bear shirt, referring to the skins they wore. But some scholars have proposed an alternative, bear shirt, meaning they fought without armor. I now saw a third possibility, a symbolic one. They were bare of their own selves, their humanity stripped away, leaving only the raw, animalistic spirit channeled through the seer ritual. The animal skins weren't just trophies, they were ritual vestments, tools to help invoke the animal spirit, just as a Siberian shaman would wear a deer's antlers. I pictured it now, a scene as vivid as if I were there. A young man, perhaps already hardened by battle, is chosen. He is taken from his comrades, led to a secluded hut deep in the forest, or to the edge of a lonely bog. There, the seer master, the cult leader, begins the process. 4 days, the initiate is starved, deprived of sleep, and subjected to the ceaseless, hypnotic rhythm of a drum and a low, guttural chant. He is given brews of henbane, nightshade, and fungi, the accelerants Dr. Thorne spoke of, not just to poison his body, but to unmoor his mind from reality. He is told stories of the great bear spirit, shown the screaming totems, taught to see his own reflection not as a man but as a beast. His identity is systematically dismantled. The fear, the pain, the disorientation, it all builds into a psychic pressure cooker. Then they give him a trigger. A word. A roar. A specific beat of the drum. And they release the pressure. The result is the Berserker gang. A complete psychotic break, but a controlled one. A storm of rage that can be unleashed upon an enemy. The man is gone. In his place is a walking vessel for pure, unadulterated violence. The shamanic journey into the spirit world, a quest for knowledge, had been inverted into a descent into madness, a path to oblivion. The creators of these men weren't just generals, they were priests of a dark, twisted faith. They had taken the sacred and made it profane, turning a spiritual quest into an assembly line for monsters. The bog wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a laboratory. It was the place where souls were unmade. A program this sophisticated, this psychologically brutal, couldn't be the work of a few rogue shamans. Or a disparate warrior clan. It required resources, secrecy, and a steady supply of subjects. It required the power of a state. As my investigation deepened, a single formidable name began to cast a long shadow over all my findings. Harald Fairhair. History paints Harald as the great unifier, the first king of Norway. The sagas, particularly Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, celebrate him as a visionary leader who subjugated the petty kings and forged a single powerful nation in the late 9th century. And at his side, in every account, are his champions, his elite bodyguard, his ultimate weapon, the Berserkers. The official narrative is that these warriors flocked to his banner, drawn by his charisma and strength. He simply recognized their unique talent and put it to good use. But now, with the grim knowledge I had gathered, I saw his role in a far more sinister light. He wasn't their employer. He was their architect. The respected figure with a dark secret was not some shadowy sorcerer, but the celebrated father of a nation. My research shifted from pharmacology and ritual to power politics and military strategy. Harald Fairhair's unification was not a peaceful process. It was a bloody, decades-long campaign against fierce resistance. He needed an edge, a weapon so terrifying it would not just defeat his enemies, but shatter their will to fight. He needed psychological warfare. And the nascent, shamanic practices of the Berserker gang provided the perfect raw material. I began to see him as a ruthless innovator. He didn't just stumble upon Berserkers, he cultivated them. He saw the potential in these fringe, ecstatic rituals and systemized them. He provided the resources, the secluded locations like the bog at Skogstad, and, most importantly, the political cover. He transformed a scattered rural superstition into a centralized, state-sponsored military program. The shaman priests who once served small communities were now on the king's payroll. Their job was no longer to heal or divine, but to manufacture living weapons for the king's wars of conquest. This reframing of Harald's reign was a chilling revelation. It turned a national hero into something much darker, a master manipulator who preyed on the vulnerable for political gain. Who were the recruits? They wouldn't have been the sons of powerful jarls. They would have been the outcasts, the dispossessed, the mentally fragile. Men suffering from what we now call combat PTSD, their minds already cracked by the horrors of war. Men who were desperate for a purpose, for a place in the king's new world. Harald offered them one. He gave them a new identity, a place in his personal guard, the herd. He made them feel chosen, special, touched by the gods. But it was a lie. He was merely feeding their trauma, harnessing their instability, and pointing it at his enemies. The Berserkers were not his loyal retainers. They were his disposable assets. Their revered status was a cage. They were paraded as heroes, but they were kept separate, feared and isolated. Their loyalty was not born of honor but of dependency. They were bound to the king because he was the only one who understood their condition, because he had created it. He was their master, their provider, and their jailer. The full, monstrous weight of this hit me one night in the library, staring at a passage in the Heimskringla. It describes Harald's berserkers as Odin's men, who went into battle without armor and were mad as hounds or wolves, strong as bears or wild oxen, and killed people at a blow, but neither fire nor iron told upon them. I had read that passage 100 times, always with a sense of awe. Now I read it with profound sickness. It wasn't a description of demigods. It was propaganda. It was Harald's own marketing, designed to build a terrifying legend around his new weapon. He wasn't just conquering lands. He was conquering minds, seeding fear in his enemies before the battle was even joined. And the men he used to do it paid the ultimate price, sacrificing their sanity and their souls on the altar of his ambition. The romantic myth of the berserker died for me in that moment. It was replaced by the cold, hard face of political expediency. These men were not the embodiment of the Viking spirit. They were the first victims of a new kind of warfare, one fought not just with swords and axes, but with the deliberate, systematic breaking of the human mind. The monster wasn't the man in the bearskin. It was the king on the throne. The wars of unification did not last forever. Harald Fairhair forged his kingdom, and an uneasy peace settled over the land. But what happens to a weapon when the war is over? What do you do with men who have been systematically programmed for uncontrollable violence when there are no more enemies to kill? My investigation turned to the grim twilight of the berserker, the period after the glory faded. The answer I discovered was as tragic as their creation. Society, which had celebrated them in wartime, now rejected them in peace. The very qualities that made them legendary on the battlefield made them intolerable in a functioning community. They were walking reminders of the horrors of war, their rage no longer a national asset, but a public menace. I delved into the later sagas, the ones set in the newly established communities of Norway and Iceland. The portrayal of the berserker shifts dramatically. They are no longer the king's champions. They are wandering marauders, social pariahs. They appear at farmsteads, their eyes wild, demanding food, hospitality, and sometimes wives. Their battle fury, the berserker gang, is no longer triggered by the call to war but seems to erupt spontaneously, often with devastating consequences. I pieced together a composite narrative, a ghost story haunting the periphery of the official histories. Imagine a man, let's call him Bjorn. For 10 years he served in the king's guard. He was taught that his rage was a divine gift. He was praised for the slaughter he wrought. The rituals, the chants, the drugs, they became his only reality. He was a hero. But now the king is secure on his throne. The program is disbanded. Bjorn is given a plot of land, a small pension, and told to be a farmer. But how can a man whose mind has been rewired for chaos cultivate a field? How can a man who has communed with manufactured demons live next to ordinary people? He suffers from flashbacks, what the sagas might call visitations. A sudden noise, a dropped pot, a crying baby, might be the trigger that flips the switch. The carefully conditioned psychosis, no longer directed by a shaman or a battle commander, erupts. He enters the berserker gang in the middle of his own village. He might kill his livestock. He might attack his neighbors. In one horrifying saga fragment, a berserker in his fit kills his own son, mistaking him for a foe in the fog of his madness. His family, who once looked at him with pride, now looks at him with terror. His children hide from him. His wife sleeps with an axe by the bed. He is utterly alone, trapped in the prison of his own skull with a monster that his king created. This social cost is the most profound and forgotten part of the berserker story. The victims were not just the enemy soldiers. The victims were the families and communities who had to absorb these broken men. And ultimately, the victims were the berserkers themselves. They were used, lauded, and then discarded, left to deal with the psychological wreckage alone. The state that made them now condemned them. The Christianization of Scandinavia was the final nail in their coffin. The church had no place for Odin's madmen. The laws I had discovered earlier, the ones that outlawed the berserker gang, were not just about social order, they were part of a broader cultural and religious cleansing. The practices of the berserker, the shamanic rituals, the trances, the animal spirits, were now officially demonic. The man who was once a holy warrior was now a cursed soul, a practitioner of forbidden magic. The state that had perfected the art of creating them now perfected the art of hunting them. The final, tragic irony is that they were outlawed by the descendants of the very kings who had first weaponized them. The system that built them up now had to tear them down to maintain its own newfound stability and Christian piety. My heart ached for these men. I saw them not as monsters but as profoundly damaged veterans, cast aside by the society they were forged to protect. They were a living testament to the truth that the first casualty of war is not the body but the soul. And that for some, the war never, ever ends. They were the forgotten, their personal agony erased from the grand narrative of nation-building. The sagas remember the battles. The kings are immortalized in stone. But the quiet, desperate horror of what came after, the isolation, the fear, the madness, was buried just like the ritual tools in the Skogstad bog. It was a truth too uncomfortable, too shameful to be remembered. The weight of my research had become a physical burden. I felt haunted by the men I was studying, their silent screams echoing from the pages of the sagas and the artifacts from the bog. I knew I had to speak to someone to test my conclusions against the established fortress of academic consensus. There was only one person whose opinion mattered, a veritable giant in the field, Professor Magnus Rask. Rask was the gatekeeper of Viking history in Scandinavia. His books were the standard texts. His narrative of the heroic berserker, the loyal housecarl of the king, was the one I had once taught myself. To challenge him was to challenge the entire discipline. I arranged a meeting at his office at the university, a wood-paneled sanctuary that smelled of leather and intellectual certainty. He greeted me with a thin, polite smile, but his eyes were like chips of Nordic ice. He saw me as a promising, if slightly eccentric colleague. He had no idea I was there to burn his world down. I began slowly, laying out the initial discovery at the Skogstad bog. He nodded along, intrigued by the anomaly. But then I moved to my rereading of the sagas, focusing on the fear and ostracism. His smile tightened. When I brought up the medical and psychological evidence, the weaponized PTSD, the use of hallucinogens as accelerants rather than a primary cause, he held up a hand. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice laced with condescending patience. "This is fascinating, of course, as a thought experiment, but you are psychologizing myth. You are applying modern, clinical frameworks to a society that operated on a completely different spiritual plane. These men weren't traumatized. They were divinely inspired. Theirs was a sacred fury, a gift from Odin. To reduce it to a pathology is to fundamentally misunderstand their worldview. It's ethnocentric." The accusation hung in the air. It was the ultimate academic shutdown. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear and anger. I was not just arguing a theory. I was fighting for the humanity of the men he so easily dismissed as mythical archetypes. "With all due respect, Professor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "is it not more ethnocentric to assume they were so different from us that they couldn't be broken? That their minds were immune to the horrors of war and the manipulations of their leaders? The sagas themselves are filled with evidence of their suffering." I pushed the photographs of the bog finds across his desk. The screaming totem. The teeth marks on the shield. "Is this divinity?" I asked, my voice rising. "Or is this agony? Is this a gift from a god, or is this the work of a man, a king who needed a weapon so terrible it would win him a kingdom? Look at the laws, Magnus. The Gragas outlawed them. Why would a society ban its connection to the divine?" He glanced at the photos, a flicker of something, annoyance? Discomfort? In his eyes. "Laws change," he said dismissively. "The coming of Christianity demonized all the old ways. It's a political text, not a social commentary on the well-being of warriors." The confrontation felt raw, intensely personal. I saw in his face the stubborn refusal to let go of a clean, heroic past. His berserker was a national symbol, a pillar of the Viking identity he had dedicated his life to upholding. My berserker was a dirty, inconvenient, and profoundly human tragedy. He was defending a myth. I was defending a victim. So Harald Fairhair was just a lucky general who happened to have these god-touched warriors on his side? I pressed. Or was he a brilliant, ruthless strategist who saw the potential in shamanic rituals, who systemized them, funded them, and created a production line for psychologically shattered soldiers? Soldiers he then used to terrify his opposition into submission before discarding them when they were no longer useful? Which story does the evidence more strongly support? He stood up, his tall frame towering over the desk. The interview was over. "You are weaving a conspiracy theory, Alistair," he said, the use of my first name a final dismissive pat on the head. "It's a compelling narrative, I'll grant you that. Dark, dramatic. But it is not history. It is speculation built on a handful of anomalous artifacts and a willful misreading of the sources. I suggest you return to the accepted scholarship before you damage your reputation." I walked out of his office not defeated but galvanized. His refusal to engage with the evidence, his retreat into the safety of dogma, was the final confirmation I needed. The truth I had uncovered was dangerous because it was ugly. It replaced a heroic fantasy with a story of abuse, exploitation, and state-sponsored cruelty. It implicated the founding father of the nation in a horrific crime against his own men. Rask wasn't just defending a historical interpretation. He was defending a comforting lie. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I could no longer be complicit in it. My path was clear. The world needed to see the Berserker not through the romantic haze of myth, but in the cold, harsh light of what was done to them. The confrontation with Rask solidified my resolve. I had all the pieces: the ritual site, the psychological mechanism, the political architect, the tragic aftermath. Now I had to assemble them, to step back and narrate the entire horrifying life cycle of a Berserker, not as a historian citing sources, but as a witness bearing testimony to a forgotten truth. The story begins not with a hero but with a target. He is a young man, perhaps 19 or 20. He has seen his first battle and it has broken something inside him. He is quiet, prone to nightmares, his hands shake. He is on the fringe of the warrior society, his trauma mistaken for weakness. He is perfect. He is noticed by a recruiter, an older man with watchful eyes who speaks the language of glory and destiny, a priest in the service of the king. The young man is offered a place of honor, a chance to join the king's own guard. It is an irresistible promise of belonging and purpose. He accepts and he vanishes. He is taken to a place like the Skogstad Bog, a place of isolation and power. Here his deconstruction begins. His name is taken from him. His old clothes are burned. His personal weapon is ritually broken. He is no longer himself, he is raw material. The process is relentless. He is starved for days, his body weakened. He is forced into grueling physical exertion, pushing him past the point of exhaustion. He is deprived of sleep, his perceptions blurring, the line between waking and dreaming eroding. All the while the chant is constant. A low, guttural drone, accompanied by the hypnotic, driving beat of a drum. It is the sound of his own identity dissolving. Then come the drugs. The belladonna, the henbane, the mushroom brews. They are not a feast but a violation. Forced upon him, they rip his mind from its moorings. The world dissolves into a terrifying tapestry of hallucination and paranoia. The shaman priests guide his madness. They show him the totems, the images of screaming men and predatory beasts. They whisper in his ear that this is not madness but apotheosis. He is not losing his mind. He is gaining the spirit of the bear, the fury of the wolf. He is becoming a god. The final stage is the forging of the trigger. Through repetition and reinforcement, his psychotic state is linked to a specific stimulus. A roar, a shield bite, the sight of the enemy banner. The trauma he already carried is magnified 1,000 times and then channeled into a single, explosive outlet. Finally he is ready. He is given the bearskin to wear, a symbol of his new nature. He is brought before his King Harald Fairhair. The king looks upon his creation not with compassion, but with pride of ownership. He has his weapon. On the battlefield the trigger is pulled. The man is gone. In his place is the Berserker gang. A storm of pure, unthinking violence. He feels no pain, no fear, no empathy. He is a biological machine designed for one purpose: to kill. He howls, he bites his shield, he slaughters indiscriminately, his actions seeding terror that breaks enemy morale far more effectively than any sword. He is magnificent. He is terrifying. He is a success. And after the battle he collapses. The psychochemical storm subsides, leaving behind a devastation that is absolute. He is left prostrate, weak as a newborn, his mind a wasteland of fractured memories and searing guilt. His comrades drag him back to camp, handling him with a mixture of awe and fear. He is a hero but no one will meet his eye. This cycle repeats for years. He is broken and rebuilt, unleashed and discarded over and over again. Each time, a little more of the man he once was is eroded away. The trigger becomes more sensitive, the madness harder to contain. Until one day the war's end. The program is dismantled. He is given a farm and a pat on the back. He is sent home. But he can never truly go home because home is a place that no longer exists in his shattered mind. He is left alone with the monster the king built inside him, a monster that now has no wars to fight, and it begins to turn on him and on everyone he loves. This was the true story. A story not of divine warriors but of damaged men. It was a cycle of abuse, from recruitment to disposal, orchestrated by the state for its own gain. The glory of the Berserker was a lie, painted over a masterpiece of human cruelty. I stand once more at the edge of the Skogstad bog. It's late autumn and a low, spectral mist clings to the dark water, blurring the line between earth and sky. The excavation site is gone, covered over, the sterile white tent replaced by the silence of the peat. But I know what lies beneath. The broken sword, the screaming totem, the jumbled bones of man and beast. The evidence of a crime. My investigation is over. The mystery is solved, but there is no triumph in it, no satisfying slam of a case-closed file. There is only the immense, sorrowful weight of the truth. I came here looking to understand a myth, and I found a tragedy of exploitation. The Berserker is no longer a symbol of power to me. He is a symbol of profound human suffering, a testament to the horrors we are willing to inflict on one another in the name of ambition and glory. The legend I once cherished has been replaced by an image that will never leave me. A terrified young man, his mind being systematically torn apart by ritual and poison, all to serve the will of a king. My journey has cost me my professional certainties, and perhaps my reputation among traditionalists like Rask. I have unraveled a national myth, a story that gave a people a sense of a heroic, divinely touched past. But that comfort was built on the forgotten agony of the men who were used as its foundation. Closure, I realize now, is not about finding all the answers. It's about learning to live with them. It's about giving a voice back to those who were silenced. My work is no longer about celebrating the glorious violence of the Viking Age, but about bearing witness to its hidden costs. It is about honoring the forgotten victims, not just the people who died at the hands of a berserker in his rage, but the berserker himself, the first and most enduring victim of the entire process. He has been reframed in my mind, no longer a monster or a demigod, but a man. A man who was targeted, broken, weaponized, and then thrown away, his sanity the price of a king's crown. The mist swirls around me, cold and damp. The air is utterly still. In the silence of this place I can almost hear them. The frantic chanting, the rhythmic drum, the howl of a mind coming undone. It is the sound of history's dark machinery at work. I did not want to uncover this. I did not want to be the one to tell this story. But the bog yielded its secrets to me, and I cannot, in good conscience, bury them again. The truth is heavy. It is dark. But it is real. And it is the only memorial the men sacrificed in this place will ever have. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch, and I am a historian. I used to think my job was to tell the stories of the victors. I now know it is to find the voices of the lost.